Hello, young people of the internet, and welcome to another episode of Bright and Early, the web series from the Bill of Rights Institute, where we talk about all of today's news and how it relates to history and what you can do to kind of process it all. And in order to start, I am always here with my colleagues, Gary and Kirk. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hey.
How are you?
Good. I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for asking. The news cycle has been really heavy. I think, as we're like moving into kind of tensions between different groups, different states are coming together, and different parts of states are in conflict with other parts of states, and it's been a little intense, I think, for me. How's it been for you guys?
Yeah, I would agree. It's interesting. I take a look at sort of how it has developed over time. It wasn't super long ago that we were all at work or out doing things, and then little by little things changed. And that gradual change seems to be going through a new phase now, I'm feeling, with just the concept of at what point will things develop? At what point will we come together and start moving into different ways of doing things? And it's a tough question that no one person has an answer to. And it's interesting seeing how groups of people, who just see things in different ways are making decisions about it.
Yeah, I think that's right, Gary. And it's funny, last week and every week we've been talking about watching this crisis sort of unfold. And I think all of us are used to fast-paced things. And this has been a crisis that's just been evolving and unfolding over days and weeks, which is out of step, I think, for a lot of the other things we've experienced. And, I think at one point, either here or on another webinar, we were talking about, people's experience with September 11th and how that was a big moment. And then within the next couple of weeks, we were still dealing with that big moment, but life was getting back to a semblance of what reality is going to look like. I feel like this has been weeks of that crisis moment, and we're still not knowing kind of where we are. And I think that's playing into it, and it's a strange and challenging thing to deal with.
So there's a concept in chemistry and physics called delta, which is change over time. It's the Greek symbol delta, which is the triangle, but it means change over time. And I think that when we're in periods, there are periods of your life that have like a greater delta. There's more change over time. Like the year from age 5 to 6, not super delta, right? The year from age 15 to 16, maybe super delta-y, right?
Right.
Like you're a very different person when you were 14 than you were when you're 15. You're a very different person when you're 17 than you were when you were 16. You're not as different a person from 7 to 8, right? And so I think one of the things we're all working with is this idea that there's so much change happening so quickly, it's overwhelming. And a lot of those changes are not small, right? They're not like little things, I can't, they're out of stock of this one thing, or, are my, like, things that used to bother me. Like, they canceled that performance that I was really looking forward to, right? It's not single things. It's like lots of things. I mean, and some of the things are really interesting, like the Supreme Court starting to live stream stuff. That's really interesting.
Right.
Some of the things are a little scarier, like what kinds of freedoms do you have in a crisis? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Our topic today, our theme of the day, is civil liberties in a crisis. And so one of the things that we've seen a lot of over the past couple of weeks has been these various protests happening across the world. And specifically in the US, there have been protests about different kinds of things done in different ways in different states at different scales, and how people are reacting to those protests and what they're saying about the protests. And to start us off, the quote that kind of gets bandied around a lot the most is this quote that's often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, but it's misattributed. It's not quoted exactly the way that it was written, where he said, so it would, and Kirk can give us more context here, but it was January 1775. He was part of the American delegation to Britain. And at the end of their discussion, he wrote a letter where he said something that became very famous, which is, they who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And so I don't bring this up to say that the things that are happening right now are inappropriate or not what we should be doing. But it's our responsibility as citizens and as people who care about liberty and civil liberties to start thinking about what the implications are and what it means that our right to assemble has been restricted, what it means that our right to certain kinds of privacy may be restricted in the future, and how all of that, again, it's our duty, that's the responsibility as part of being in a democratic republic, as part of being someone who cares about individual freedom and the freedom of their neighbors. And so we're going to start talking about that. And I think the place we always like to start with all of our episodes is with Kirk and giving us a little bit of historical context. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Kirk, to kind of start walking us through some ways we can frame this within the history of civil liberties in the U.S.
Sure. And, I think what you said is, really important, Rachel, which is the idea that vigilance and being, paying attention to these different things isn't being critical of them. It's just simply being, oh man, things are going very quickly here. Let me see if I can get this to share appropriately. There we go. So it's not about being, it's about paying attention to what's going on and just making sure that we're not blindly going forward with whatever may be happening. And I think it's up to each one of us to be able to look at the information, as we were talking about last week, being critical consumers of information, trying to parse out what we think on issues, and understanding that different people in a democracy are going to have different views. And it's the expression of those views and the healthy expression of those views and the healthy voicing of different opinions that allows us as a society to function appropriately and well. And so I just wanted to take a couple minutes just to talk about a few other crises in American history where these kinds of questions have come up. One of the most famous is in 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected president, and he comes into a situation where, because of his election and his views on slavery, and there's suddenly a rupture and states secede, and you have a situation now where the country is fractured and we're on the eve of civil war, and Abraham Lincoln is trying to cobble together what he can and maintain some grip on the nation. And so he does some things that people find extra constitutional. He suspends the Maryland legislature from operating, and he arrests individuals, particularly in Maryland, and suspends their writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means, is in Latin, is bring forth the body. It means that you have the right to be brought to trial and have evidence brought before you. That evidentiary necessity is onerous on the government, especially when they're conducting a war. And so Abraham Lincoln says, we're going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and we're going to arrest these people because Maryland was making moves to prevent Union troops from coming to Washington, D.C. Rightly or wrongly, that's the action he took. In the Constitution, it's stipulated that the writ of habeas corpus cannot be suspended, except in cases of rebellion. He saw it as a case of rebellion, and so suspended it. One of the gentlemen, Merriman, who was arrested for this, thought otherwise, petitioned the Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus, meaning he has to have evidence brought against him. And Roger B. Taney was the Chief Justice, said, yes, that needs to happen. Abraham Lincoln said, I'm not going to enforce that, and used his stipulation as commander-in-chief not to enforce it. And anyway, it came to a stalemate. But this is still a hotly debated case over whether or not what took place here was right, legal, or just. And I encourage you, if you want to look more into it, it's a really interesting one. But the point here is that even within that suspension of the writ, that discussion that takes place, I think, is really interesting and rich. Another famous one, and this has actually been banted about a little bit in the news lately, is a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer from 1952. Here, Harry Truman was concerned that there's going to be a strike at steel mills, and that strike would put in danger the war effort that America was engaged in Korea. So he made a move to take over control and operate those steel mills as the federal government. And there were serious concerns about whether or not the president had the ability to do that. So in a 6-3 decision, Hugo Black, writing for the majority, said, no, the president cannot do that without Congress stipulating that he's allowed to do that. So essentially it means that the legislature had to approve for the president to have those powers. And then in that case, ostensibly, he would then be able to make that kind of a move in a case of emergency. So I highlight both of these again to say these are both moments in time where there was something outside of the ordinary taking place. There are emergency situations. And so the executive, whose authority it is and whose responsibility is to be the most, in the words of our founders, energetic. And by that we mean effective and fast-acting part of our governmental structure, acts quickly to try to mitigate what they see as problems for sort of the greater common good. But you immediately see people questioning whether or not that's appropriate, whether or not these actions are appropriate. I think the same things are happening now. So I say that to say this protest movement that we're seeing isn't new and is a part of what happens in our country, because we are a country that is rooted on democracy, deliberation. We're very protective of civil liberties as sort of an instinctive kind of a thing. Whether or not in these cases things have been appropriate or not, I think will get talked about for a long time to come. I think we have many years of discussing whether or not these things that are unfolding and happening and the steps that the government has taken were appropriate. But right now, in the case of emergency, executive authorities are doing what they think needs to be done in order to stem the control of this terrible pandemic that we're experiencing. And so we'll leave it up to time to be able to find out what that looks like. But the interesting thing and the rich thing I think about our civil discourse now is seeing these things unfold and watching the interplay between government and the people, and how it is that each one works to try and check and relate to the other.
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of call to action, Kirk. And that's that we're living this incredible civic moment, right? That and I talk about this with our teacher colleagues, but also with my friends who are young people. And Gary, you maybe used to have some context because you have lived through some kind of civic crises, being from New York and 9/11. But there's a moment happening right now where kind of federalism, like the right to civic institutions, a sense of our rights to our civil liberties is much more present than I think it generally is. And so that vigilance that we all have, that we're responsible for as citizens within a democratic republic, is heightened in a way. I mean, we're just all much more attuned kind of to what's going on. And I think that feeds into kind of what BRI is trying to do with the young people. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who manages not only all of our teacher programs, but all of our student programs as well, including one of my favorite products that BRI has. So Gary, go ahead.
Sure. No, and you're exactly right. It's weird to think of there being a normal course of business in our nation, right? I mean, we've got millions and hundreds of millions of people in our day-to-day lives. But you're right. Every once in a while, there is an event or a development that highlights that normal course of business, right? And what things and decisions we're all making that are connections to each other. I mean, we've all lived through some major things, right? If you're of a certain age, there have been huge events that have focused everybody at one point to ask about these things. And I'm thinking a lot about how you, Rachel, were talking about these ideas of safety and the ideas of liberty, and what Kirk was saying in terms of, I mean, even the phrase habeas corpus, right? This idea of doing something in person. Well, we value each of these things individually. And that's something at BRI we talk about a lot. And when you're learning about it, sometimes it's easy to think of values independently and to say, yes, I absolutely support these. But then you're right. Sometimes there are events that put values in either real or perceived odds with each other. And so we call these crises, right? A crisis truly is something that is affecting large amounts of people, and that multiple sides each have incredible value. So how do we decide to move forward? And you're right, one of the ways that we like to tackle this is to encourage students to get involved with the discussion about other and say, how do you weigh these decisions? The way that we do this online that everybody can jump in on is something called Think the Vote. And when we say think the vote, it very much says, let's take a look at what's happening and see these important values. And if they are in conflict, there are the perception of more or less two sides, but it's far more complex than that. So I'm backtracking to the main site here because this is an ongoing thing for students. It's for you, the students, it's just thinkthevote.com, pretty easy to remember. And we update this frequently, every other week. But I want to call your attention to, and I have to lean over here because I can't. So the question that we have right now is a really interesting one to me because it asks you to think about two conflicting values. On the one side, public health, public safety, for that matter. And in this particular case, it does involve having people come together, being closer than 6 feet apart, or being at businesses or religious functions or whatever, in terms of having people together. On this other side is liberties, your civil liberties. And again, an interesting and important thing about the situation we're in is there's individual rights and then group rights, right? And I individually might very much want something, but society, it's really depending on a lot of people. So this question that we're posing to you is to say, how do you explore these different things? And to agree whether or not one supersedes or is more important than, or should be more adhered to than the other. And we're not saying one or the other is, and that's why it's a question for you. I mean, on the one side, there's the idea that coming together physically can be dangerous right now. I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but right now some of the policies are saying, you know, through cleanliness, through being together, through knowing who does or does not have exposure, that's a very real concern. But on the flip side, there's also the fact that assemblies are a value, right? So, I mean, even the right to assemble itself is something that is a core value of ours and something really important. And for us to function as a society, coming together is very, very important. But what happens when the coming together is the problem and the problem is not allowing to come together? It gets very sort of muddled. But we don't give up at that point, right? We say, all right, let's see if we can sort through it. What do you think? And what do others think? And what are you basing these on? So normally I like to talk about observing what's around you and journaling. Well, in this case, I really encourage you to think about the policies that are out there. What is good now? What is good for the future? Maybe what's important now, is that going to change how? What would be the best advice or recommendations you would give? And the same thing for personal liberties or the liberties, the freedoms that come together. Who gets to decide these things? I mean, when this was all starting a few months ago, who knows? You know, these decisions, how are they being made? And what will happen in the future? Will they reverse eventually? You know, those decisions were an individual business. How do you know when it's okay to open? How do you know when it's okay to come back together? Again, you as a young person, you know what we know, and you have the ability to research and to find out more. So we really encourage that to happen, and it's just great to ask that question and to really consider values in relationship to each other.
Absolutely. And I think that call to action to do your research is for all of us, no matter your age, right? I mean, it's that we have a lot to think about. And Kirk, I'm sure you have many opinions on this, but the kind of messiness that we're seeing right now, the kind of difficulty in kind of having clarity of what policies should be or can be, is a feature of a democratic republic. It's so that it can respond to the citizenry in a meaningful way. But what that means is that we have to hold each other accountable. We have to figure out ways to coordinate our different interests. We have to do the research and make sure that we are knowing what our responsibility is, so we can hold others accountable to their responsibility. And luckily, we live in the age of the internet, where there are lots of resources for you to kind of poke around the internet and find help in parsing through some of this. So I really like this article on Vox. Vox, has some good articles, some not great articles, but their journalism can be really strong. And I found this article to be really helpful. And it again kind of showcases that there's a messiness. Unprecedented times mean unprecedented. It's never been the case that we've had this coordinated response to a perceived material threat that wasn't external. But then you also have interesting questions about how different technologies are impacting our protestability, our rights as defined in the Constitution. There was a lot of talk during these protests about whether or not states could censor the speech of the protesters by asking Facebook to remove the events, and what Facebook's responsibility was there. There have been lots of questions about what Facebook's responsibility is when it comes at, is it a publishing platform? Is it journalism? So there are lots of questions there. But then there's also, this is not just happening here in the US, right? Many Americans are willing to trade some civil liberties to combat coronavirus. You have a couple of really good podcasts that you can listen to. But the other thing to think about is that this isn't only happening in the US. You can think globally about different responses. Just keep in perspective that different responses are different because the legal institutions are different in different countries. Sweden and Germany have very different legal institutions than the US do. Also population. One of the things when we think about, and Gary, you taught world history, so I'm sure this is something if you want to chime in on, but what are the things we have to think about when comparing the US to other countries' responses? What would you say some things to think about are?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's a lot of it is context difference. This is a very unusual event because it's not just happening to one country. And so things to consider are exactly the knowledge of within a country of ways it's dealt with problems before. The decision making is going to be very different in very different countries. Some are very centralized, some are very decentralized. Some have multiple parties, some have different ways for citizens to vocalize or to have ideas. Some have different economic systems, and so there are different things to consider. And yet there's a commonality among them. So you're absolutely right. Context, in the same way, for those who watched earlier versions of our shows, different states have different contexts. It's a little bit more extreme because imagine if each state had a completely different governmental structure and economic system.
That would be called the European Union.
Right, exactly. So it's going to be different. So the transference of knowledge and decision making is something you have to consider when you're looking at different things. But at the same time, we're also all human. So
exactly. And I thought this was a fascinating resource. So this is the International Center for Nonprofit Law. They have a civic freedom global tracker that they're updating, which shows you, if you're curious about what not only is the response in terms of civil liberties within a particular country, but what the underlying institutions are. This is a really interesting place to just kind of explore. And then kind of what are the institutions that allow different countries to respond in different ways. So I'm sure you've all seen images of the protests here in the US. Well, there were also protests other parts of the world where different institutions exist, like lining up clearly according to social distance rules, even though you're in a protest. So we've given you a lot to think about in this very brief episode of Bright and Early. Again, we are very interested in hearing from you. What is it that you are thinking about doing, seeing, observing, interested in? Let us know, and we will incorporate it into one of our episodes. We love hearing from the young people that are watching. We know some classes are watching. We know teachers are asking students to think about some of the things that we're talking about. So we'd love to hear from you. So please comment on our YouTube channel, or send us a tweet or Instagram posts, or Instagram IM, or comment on our posts. And we're going to continue doing this. Kirk, Gary, did you have any kind of final thoughts thinking about this very complex issue of civil liberties?
No,
yeah,
I think go ahead.
Go ahead,
Kirk.
I think complexity is the right. It's complex, right? I mean, there's a lot of things going on, and that doesn't mean, as we've said on other things, complexity doesn't mean bad. It just means there are a lot of ways to think about it. There's a lot of ways to approach it, and that's why it's important to be thoughtful, and at the core to really honor how it is that other people's perspectives are, on the given situation, what other people are thinking about, what other people's opinions are, because in doing that, that really creates an atmosphere in which we have really healthy, honest conversation and deliberation, which long term I think helps get us all through crises just like this one.
Yeah, and if I may add, almost every sort of big decision like this, while complex, is also, there's always a choice in there, right? There's always your interaction with it. So even in this particular case, what you choose to do, whether that is to stay home, that is a very important choice. So there's no such thing as not doing something. This is not a theoretical thing. This is a very real day-to-day decision that you have to make because you are part of it. And so it's really interesting to think, why are you making the decisions that you're making, and why are you advocating for or against things that you are advocating for and against? So it's a really interesting non-academic sort of complexity, right? It's a real life day-to-day decision.
This civic moment is for all of us. We are all citizens of this experience, and we're all citizens of our communities going through this in a variety of ways. It doesn't matter our age. And so we all have the responsibility to be aware and informed and thoughtful about how we're interacting and responding and reacting. And so that's a big job, but that's one of the, I mean, it's an honor to have that opportunity to be an agent in our own experience, right? To be able to make decisions and take action and do our own research. There's a lot of countries where that's not the case. So on that note, go out there, do the things that you think are best, and just make sure you're a really well-informed person doing that. So we'll see you next time on Bright and Early. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.